The doors of the high-end department store swished open with a soft chime as the woman stepped inside. She was dressed simply but elegantly, a tailored coat in deep navy, a pair of black boots, and a small leather handbag. Her hair, natural and pulled back into a neat bun, framed her face with a quiet grace. She was mid-40s, her expression calm, poised, and contemplative as she walked through the polished floors, her heels clicking softly with each step. She wasn't here to make a scene. In fact, she wasn't even sure what she was looking for, just browsing, taking in the latest collections. The plush, velvet-lined aisles, the designer labels hanging from the racks. It was all a world of polished luxury that she could navigate with ease. But she wasn't a stranger to this kind of space. The woman paused to admire a silk scarf displayed prominently on a shelf. Her fingers gently grazed the fabric, appreciating the softness, its delicate sheen catching the overhead lights. As she considered the price tag, a shadow lingered at the edge of her peripheral vision. She glanced over her shoulder and caught the eye of the young white clerk who had been following her since she entered. The clerk, in his late 20s, dressed sharply in a store uniform, stood by a display, watching her with what she could only interpret as suspicion. His gaze darted from her to the items she was touching, then back again, never lingering on her face with the same warmth or professionalism he showed other customers. It wasn't obvious at first, just the occasional shift of his eyes, the subtle stiffening of his posture whenever she moved past him. She had learned over the years to pick up on such things: a slight tilt of the head, a stiff hand on the register. These were the signs she knew too well, even in the most luxurious of settings. The quiet assumption that someone like her didn't belong here. Despite his presence, she remained composed, her movements calm and deliberate as she continued to browse. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't let it ruffle her. She wasn't going to let this young man or his silent judgments distract her from the quiet joy of the moment. Her fingers brushed the soft fabric of a cashmere sweater. She smiled to herself. Perhaps she would buy it. After all, she deserved a little treat today. But the clerk wasn't done. His gaze narrowed as he walked closer, pretending to straighten the shelves beside her, but his eyes never left her. She could feel the weight of his suspicion, a silent, unspoken narrative playing in his mind. He didn't know her. He didn't know who she was, but she knew what he saw: a black woman, alone, browsing the store with no apparent intent to buy. And in that moment, the assumptions made in the silence between them began to fill the space. He wasn't seeing a woman with power, grace, or purpose. He was seeing a threat. As she reached for another item, he made a subtle, almost imperceptible move toward the store's security cameras, pressing a button under the counter. The clerk's footsteps grew louder as he approached, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor, the sound too deliberate to be coincidental. He smiled, but it was tight, thin-lipped, the kind of smile one gives when trying to mask suspicion. "Can I help you find something?" His voice was polite, but it carried an undercurrent of something else, something less friendly, as if the words themselves had been weighed down with unspoken doubt. The woman didn't flinch. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, her smile warm yet distant. She didn't need to engage in this, but it was part of the dance, the ritual of navigating spaces where people like her weren't often seen or welcomed. "I'm just browsing," she said softly, her tone courteous but firm. "Thank you." She turned back to the shelves, her fingers tracing the edges of a leather handbag, then a pair of boots. A few items caught her eye, and she picked them up, considering their craftsmanship, the fit, the materials. The clerk didn't move. Instead, he lingered in her periphery, standing a little too close for comfort, his eyes fixed on the items she picked up, then back on her. "Those are quite expensive," he remarked after a moment, his voice casual but pointed. "You sure you're looking for something like that?" The woman didn't respond immediately, as if weighing whether to engage or not. She glanced at the boots again, then at the clerk, her gaze cool and measured. She had heard remarks like this before, thinly veiled judgments that floated just below the surface of everyday interactions. The kind people like her had to learn to ignore or face the consequences. "Yes, I think I'll try these," she said, her voice even, as if she hadn't noticed the implied insult. The clerk shifted, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. though his smile remained plastered on his face. Well, those types of boots can be a bit hard to pull off. Not everyone can, make them work. She tilted her head, her expression unchanged, and picked up a silk blouse. I think they're beautiful, she replied, her calm voice deflecting his passive-aggressive comment as though it were nothing more than a stray breeze. But the clerk wasn't ready to let it go. He moved a little closer, perhaps trying to block her path or subtly reassert control over the space she had entered. His eyes flicked to her face, then back to the clothing in her hands, as though searching for a reason to dismiss her presence entirely. Some people just don't quite have the right style for this place, he continued, his tone sugar-sweet, but dripping with the venom of a judgment he could barely hide. I mean, it's more for people with a certain taste, but I'm sure you know that. He gave a slight, awkward chuckle, his eyes lingering a moment too long on her choice of clothing. She felt it then, the underlying accusation that hung in the air between them, thick with the unsaid. You don't belong here. It wasn't just about the clothes, or the boots, or the blouse. It was about the space, the store, the world he thought she didn't deserve to inhabit. She stood tall, holding his gaze now, the calmness of her expression never wavering. She knew exactly what he was doing. His dismissive remarks, his overbearing presence, they weren't accidental. He was trying to push her out, to make her feel small, to make her question her right to be there, to justify, perhaps, the call he had already made to security. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, the subtle rise of frustration, the tightening of her jaw. But she didn't react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she took a deep breath and let the moment pass, as if she were above it. Thank you for your concern, she said, her voice cold but polite, her gaze still fixed firmly on him. But I know exactly what I'm doing. He blinked, slightly thrown off by her composure. But instead of backing off, he pushed further. His body language shifted, becoming more obvious in his judgment. He now followed her step for step, hovering like a shadow as she made her way to the accessories aisle. Each time she picked up a new item, he made a subtle sound of disapproval, as though everything she chose was simply wrong, too flashy, too expensive, too much for someone like her. In that moment, the clerk's unease was clear. He was no longer just a clerk doing his job. He was a gatekeeper, scrutinizing every decision she made, assuming that her presence here was a mistake. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her, but she didn't let it break her. She wasn't just any customer in this store. She was someone with a presence, someone with purpose. And soon, he would learn just how wrong he was about her. The atmosphere in the store had shifted, the air thick with unspoken tension. The woman had just placed the silk blouse back on the shelf and was about to walk toward the register, her movements slow and deliberate, when the clerk stepped directly in her path, his smile now entirely gone. I'm going to have to ask to see your receipt, he said, his tone suddenly sharp, an edge of authority lacing his words. She paused for a moment, looking at him as if she hadn't heard him clearly. Then, she nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out the small folded receipt from the last few items she had purchased. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that would raise any questions. She handed it over without a word. The clerk snatched it from her hand, his eyes flicking quickly over the printed details. His lips tightened into a thin line. Then he looked up, his gaze now colder, more accusing. This isn't right, he said, his voice low but firm. You didn't purchase everything you've got with you. Her stomach tightened, a sense of unease creeping up her spine. Excuse me? She asked, her voice still calm, but with a quiet edge that betrayed her growing frustration. The clerk's eyes darted to the items she was holding, a pair of boots, the leather handbag, and the blouse she'd only just picked up, and then to her, as though seeing something unfamiliar, something out of place in the equation. You've taken more than you've paid for, he declared, his voice louder now, drawing attention from nearby shoppers. The words felt like a slap in the face, not just an accusation, but an insinuation. His gaze was cold, unwavering. She felt the weight of his words settle on her like a shadow, and a brief flicker of disbelief flashed across her mind. This can't be happening. Not here. Not like this. Her response came quickly, too quickly for him to backpedal. I've bought everything. I have my receipt, and I'm not stealing, she said, her voice now laced with the unmistakable edge of indignation. But the clerk, his face flushed with embarrassment and something else resentment, perhaps wasn't ready to let it go. He looked over his shoulder, his hand reaching for the store's security button. "You'll have to wait here. I'm calling security," he said, his words sharp and final. The woman's heart raced, her mind spinning with a mixture of disbelief and fury. She was being treated like a criminal in a place she had every right to be, but she couldn't let herself react, couldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She straightened, taking a deep breath and trying to center herself. "I'm not waiting for security," she said, her voice controlled, but there was an undercurrent of defiance. "You're wrong." Before he could respond, the sharp click of the store's front door opening echoed through the aisle. The security guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark blue uniform, walked in with the confident pace of someone accustomed to handling situations just like this. His eyes flicked to the woman, then to the clerk, who was already explaining the situation, his words a blur of accusations and half-formed explanations. The security guard nodded curtly and turned his attention to her. "Ma'am, may I see your receipt?" She handed it to him without hesitation, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze, refusing to let the weight of this humiliating moment break her. He took the paper, scrutinizing it for a moment before glancing back at the clerk. "What seems to be the problem?" the security guard asked, his voice low, professional, but laced with a hint of suspicion that made her pulse quicken. The clerk, still standing rigidly in front of her, barely looked at the woman as he began his rehearsed account of events. "She's got items in her possession that she hasn't paid for. I saw her pick them up and not go to the register." He glanced at her, as though expecting her to respond, to protest, but he was already so entrenched in his own narrative that he wouldn't listen. The security guard nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the woman once more, then flicking back to the items she was holding. "And you're sure about that, right?" he asked the clerk, his voice deliberately neutral, probing. "Yes, I'm sure," the clerk snapped, his voice gaining an edge of frustration. "She has the boots, the bag, and this blouse. None of them show up on her receipt. She's trying to steal them." The woman felt a surge of anger, but she refused to let it consume her. "That's a lie," she said, her voice still measured, though her heart was pounding now. "I've paid for everything in my bag. I am not stealing anything." The security guard paused, his eyes flicking between her and the clerk. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The other customers had stopped browsing, their heads turning in subtle curiosity, some with judgment in their eyes, others with uncertainty. He looked back at the receipt, then to the clerk. Something shifted in his gaze, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps doubt. The clerk's story didn't add up. There was nothing amiss on the receipt. "You're sure about this?" the security guard repeated, this time a little softer, as though giving the clerk a chance to rethink his actions. The clerk's face reddened, his hands tightening around the counter, but he nodded firmly, unwilling to back down. "I'm sure," he said, but there was an unmistakable tremor in his voice, as if the certainty of his accusations was beginning to waver. The woman stood still, her chest tight, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to suppress the deep sense of injustice rising within her. It wasn't just about the accusation. It was about the way she was being treated, the way he saw her, a black woman, standing in a space where she was expected to prove she belonged. The security guard looked at her, his expression changing, now seeing the situation more clearly, but the damage had already been done. The tension in the store felt suffocating now, the murmurs of curious onlookers growing louder, their eyes darting between the woman, the clerk, and the security guard. The clerk stood with his arms crossed, the accusations still hanging in the air, the words unspoken but clear in his posture. "She doesn't belong here." The security guard was shifting uncomfortably, his gaze flicking from the woman's calm, unyielding face to the items she'd already paid for, and then back to the clerk, whose story was beginning to lose its conviction. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with the realization that something was wrong here, but no one dared say it out loud. The clerk's eyes were wide with growing doubt, and the security guard seemed to be caught in the middle, unsure how to proceed now that the truth didn't match his initial assumptions. Then, In the dead silence, the woman finally broke her calm demeanor. "I think it's time you knew who I am," she said, her voice as cool and composed as it had been from the start, but now carrying an edge of quiet authority. She took a step closer to the clerk, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm the mayor of this city." A beat of absolute stillness followed. The clerk froze, his eyes wide in shock. The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment, incomprehensible. His face flushed first with confusion, then with embarrassment, and perhaps even fear, as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. The security guard blinked, his posture stiffening as the words sank in. The store itself seemed to pause, the bustling background noise of muted conversations and clinking hangers fading as though the world itself had hit the pause button. I didn't," the clerk stammered, his mind racing, scrambling for an explanation, but it was already too late. His voice trailed off, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. His entire demeanor shifted from confident to utterly flustered, his eyes darting around as if looking for some escape from the immediate consequences of his actions. Another few seconds passed before the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the aisle. The manager, a middle-aged woman in a sharp blazer, appeared, her heels clicking loudly against the polished floor as she approached the scene. She was clearly flustered, her face a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes flicking from the woman to the clerk, then to the security guard, as though trying to piece together the situation. The clerk opened his mouth to explain, but his words faltered. She's been acting suspicious," he stammered. But even as he said it, the words tasted wrong on his tongue. The very nature of the accusation had lost its power in the face of the woman's calm revelation. The manager's brow furrowed as she glanced back at the woman, now understanding that something much more serious had unfolded. "Suspicious?" the manager repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief, now fully focused on the woman. She looked at the clerk, then back to the woman, a wave of realization sweeping over her face. I'm sorry, ma'am, She looked down at the receipt the security guard was still holding, then back up at the woman's face. The manager's expression shifted from confusion to immediate regret, her voice laced with sudden panic. "I'm terribly sorry. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is a misunderstanding," but the damage was already done. The woman could see it in their faces, the way the clerk couldn't quite meet her eyes. The security guard standing stiffly, clearly realizing the gravity of his own role in the humiliation. The manager, though apologetic, was too late to undo the harm. "I'm sure this is just a mistake, right?" the clerk added, his voice now higher, more nervous, though his words came too late to save himself. The security guard shifted awkwardly beside him, still unsure whether to continue with his role or to retreat entirely from the situation. The woman stood still, the silent force of her presence filling the space around them. She could feel the weight of the apology in the manager's voice, but it was hollow. The initial embarrassment, the insinuation that she was a thief, could not be erased by a few words of regret. She folded her arms calmly, still holding the items she had picked out earlier, her demeanor now the picture of composed power. "I think you need to reevaluate your store's policies on customer service," she said, her voice level but firm, "and perhaps take a moment to reconsider how you treat people who don't fit your assumptions." She glanced pointedly at the clerk, who was now shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Racial profiling isn't just bad for business, it's harmful to everyone involved." The manager's face turned crimson, but she said nothing more, knowing she had no defense for what had transpired. For a long moment, the store stood still, as if everyone were holding their breath. Finally, the manager gave a small, apologetic nod, speaking softly but with an edge of humility. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'll make sure this is addressed immediately. Please, let us take care of your items." On the house, the woman shook her head, her calm demeanor unwavering. "No," she replied simply. "I don't need anything for free. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her eyes flicked back to the clerk, who now looked utterly mortified, his face pale and his mouth set in a thin line. The manager, sensing the finality in the woman's tone, nodded quickly. Of course, we'll be taking immediate steps to ensure this doesn't happen again. Please, let me walk you out. As the store's employees scrambled to right the wrongs of the moment, the woman made her way toward the exit, her head held high. There was no satisfaction in her stride, no triumph in the defeat she had just witnessed. She had been disrespected, humiliated in front of strangers, and the apology that followed felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. But the truth remained. She was the mayor. And this store, this clerk, would not soon forget that fact. Within hours, the story was everywhere. The woman, the mayor, had managed to turn what could have been a humiliating experience into a powerful moment of social justice. As news outlets picked up the incident, it went viral. Headlines blasted across social media, with variations of the story spreading like wildfire. Mayor accused of stealing in high-end department store. What happens next will shock you. Local news stations aired the footage from the store's security cameras, the footage where the woman stood calm and composed, unflinching in the face of the clerk's accusation. The viral video showed her handing over the receipt, her quiet defiance, and her final revelation that she was, in fact, the mayor. Viewers watched as the store's staff scrambled to save face, realizing the extent of their mistake too late. Social media exploded in outrage. Users from all walks of life shared their support for the mayor. Hashtags like #NoDiorThief, racial profiling, and #support the mayor began trending. People rallied around the story, with many sharing their own experiences of being unfairly targeted or judged based on their race. The mayor's calm handling of the situation was praised, and her refusal to accept anything less than a full acknowledgement of the injustice was hailed as a powerful stand against discrimination. I can't believe this happened to the mayor. It's unbelievable. But the way she handled it, that's leadership. One user posted, sharing the video. Another wrote, "What happened to this woman is what happens to so many black people every day." But what she did, how she responded, that's the way we need to start fighting back. Public figures, activists, and even celebrities began to weigh in, using their platforms to amplify the conversation. A few hours later, an influential civil rights organization posted a statement of support for the mayor. Racial profiling is a problem that affects all of us, but it's especially insidious when it happens in spaces where we're supposed to feel safe and respected. The post read, "We stand with the mayor and call for accountability from this store." Meanwhile, at the department store, the fallout was immediate and overwhelming. The company's social media pages were bombarded with messages, some filled with outrage, others with demands for swift action. Many users expressed a desire for a boycott. The store's phone lines rang non-stop, with callers demanding that the staff be held accountable, that racial sensitivity training be implemented, and that the store issue a public apology. One particularly pointed comment went viral. "If the mayor had been anyone else, would this have happened? I bet not. Until stores like this stop assuming black people are criminals based on their appearance, nothing will change." The store's social media team scrambled to respond. Within hours, the store released a statement acknowledging the incident, but falling short of taking full responsibility. "We deeply regret the situation that occurred with one of our customers earlier today. We have reviewed the matter and are currently investigating the circumstances surrounding the incident. We strive to offer an inclusive, welcoming environment for all of our customers, and we are committed to ensuring this type of situation does not occur again." The response, however, did little to quell the storm of backlash. Critics quickly pointed out that the apology was more about damage control than actual accountability. Many demanded specific actions, not just an apology, but a complete review of store policies, retraining of staff, and a commitment to confronting bias at all levels of the company. The store's management, now under intense pressure, was forced to issue a second statement the following day. This one was more sincere, acknowledging the severity of the incident and the specific role of racial profiling in the exchange. "We are truly sorry for the distress this incident caused. After further reflection and conversations with the customer involved, we recognize that our staff acted in a way that was not reflective of our values or the standards we aim to uphold. We will be implementing comprehensive training on racial sensitivity, and we will be reaching out to the customer directly to apologize and discuss the next steps. But by then, The damage had been done. Public opinion had already shifted, and the mayor's calm yet firm stance had sparked a larger conversation, one that reached far beyond the walls of that store. In the coming days, more stories began to surface. People recounting their own experiences of being followed around stores, of being accused of theft simply because of the way they looked, of being judged before they even had a chance to show who they really were. The mayor's experience resonated with people across the city and even the country who had lived through similar indignities, often in silence. The mayor herself became a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice. Local news outlets interviewed her, but she kept her focus on the larger issue. Racial profiling isn't just something that happens to other people, she said during a press conference. It happens to all of us, and it's not enough for the companies to apologize. They need to take real, concrete actions. This is about more than a mistake. It's about systemic bias that affects how people of color are treated in every space. That's what we need to confront. Her statement became a rallying cry for people who felt that their voices had been ignored for too long. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was a wake-up call for society to examine the way it treated people based on assumptions about race, class, and appearance. By the end of the week, the store had announced an official partnership with local advocacy groups, vowing to make racial sensitivity and inclusivity a priority. But for many, the damage to the store's reputation was irreversible. Their response had come too late, and people were already organizing boycotts and finding other ways to express their disapproval. And through it all, the mayor, remained resolute. Her response wasn't about revenge, but about using her position to advocate for change. She had shown that calm, measured strength could move mountains, and that standing up for what was right was never something to back down from. She had not only defused a potentially volatile situation, she had sparked a movement, one that would challenge systems of inequality and force society to confront its biases in the most public way possible. The fallout from the incident at the department store continued to unfold in the days following the mayor's public statement. The store, under intense pressure from the public and the media, moved quickly to address the controversy. But the damage done to its reputation had already left a scar that could not be easily erased. In a tense meeting in the back office of the store, the clerk who had been at the center of the racial profiling incident was called in by the store's management. He had been summoned to account for his actions, but he knew it wasn't going to go in his favor. The manager, who had previously apologized in a somewhat half-hearted way, sat at the head of the table. Her face was hard to read, but the tension in the room was palpable. Beside her, a few senior executives of the store had flown in from the corporate office, their expressions stern as they reviewed the situation. The clerk, his face flushed with both embarrassment and fear, stood nervously in front of them. He hadn't expected things to spiral like this. All he had done was follow his instincts, make an assumption about the woman based on her appearance. It had seemed harmless at the time until it wasn't. "We've had time to reflect on the events of last week," the manager began, her voice quiet but resolute. "What happened was unacceptable, not just in the way it unfolded, but in the way it reflects poorly on our store's values." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The decision we've made is final. You're being let go, effective immediately." The clerk's face drained of color. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He opened his mouth to protest, but the manager held up a hand to stop him. "I understand this is difficult, but you crossed a line. Racial profiling is not just harmful, it's illegal, and it violates everything this company should stand for." The senior executives nodded in agreement. The clerk was silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The conversation had already shifted to the logistics of his departure. Severance pay, paperwork, security escorting him out. But nothing could make the sting of being fired for his actions go away. Outside of the meeting, the store's executives huddled with the PR team, quickly drafting a public apology. They knew that if they were going to survive this scandal, they needed to acknowledge the harm done and take immediate, concrete steps toward rectifying it. Within hours, a statement was released to the press and posted across the store's social media accounts. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred in our store last week. We take full responsibility for the actions of one of our employees and understand the harm caused by this mistake. This behavior is not reflective of our company values, and we will be making immediate changes. We will be offering a full refund to the customer involved, and we are implementing comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all employees. We are committed to making our store a welcoming space for everyone. We are deeply sorry for this unacceptable situation and are working to ensure it does not happen again. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. The apology, however, quickly became the subjects of further scrutiny. While some appreciated the company's effort, many felt the apology lacked sincerity and urgency. Some pointed out that firing the clerk was the least they could do. The real challenge would be whether the store followed through with their promises. Meanwhile, the mayor, whose name was now synonymous with dignity and strength in the face of injustice, gave her own statement. It was clear that the moment had turned into more than just an individual incident. It had sparked a larger conversation about racial profiling, the treatment of Black people in public spaces, and the responsibilities of businesses to ensure they foster truly inclusive environments. I'm grateful for the support of the community and for the attention this has brought to the issue of racial profiling, she began, her tone calm yet unwavering. But while I appreciate the apology, I want to be clear. Accountability must go beyond words. It's not enough to simply fire one employee. Real change takes work. It requires understanding, education, and a commitment to inclusivity at every level. Her voice rang out with quiet authority as she continued. I will be watching to ensure that the store follows through on their promises. Diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords. They must be the foundation of how we operate, both in business and in society. This is not just about one bad day. It's about transforming the way we see and treat each other. The mayor's statement was widely praised. Her ability to address the situation with grace while still demanding accountability struck a chord with people across the city and beyond. Her message of peaceful yet firm resistance resonated deeply with those who had felt invisible or unjustly treated for far too long. As the store began implementing their promised diversity and inclusion initiatives, the community rallied around the mayor's response. Local activists organized rallies and forums, discussing the issues raised by the incident. People from all walks of life gathered to talk about racial bias, the need for sensitivity training, and the importance of holding corporations accountable for their actions. The mayor attended several of these forums, not as a politician, but as a community member. She listened, spoke candidly about her own experiences, and shared her vision for a city where everyone, regardless of race, class, or background, could feel safe and respected. The store, despite their public apology, faced continued scrutiny. Calls for boycotts persisted, and some customers shared their intentions to avoid shopping there until they saw real changes. But there were also those who praised the store for taking steps in the right direction, believing that with time and effort, they could rebuild trust. Inside the community, however, a shift was happening. People were no longer simply complaining about the problem, they were coming together to demand lasting change. The mayor's calm and composed leadership had set the tone, and the conversation was no longer about the clerk's actions alone. It was about the systems of bias and racism that permeated everyday life. As the dust settled, it was clear that the incident at the store had sparked a much larger movement. The mayor had shown that true leadership wasn't about seeking revenge or personal gain. It was about using one's position to drive change, to challenge the status quo, and to push society to be better. The community, now more united than ever, stood behind her, not just because she was the mayor, but because she had shown them all what it meant to fight for justice with dignity, strength, and unwavering resolve. In the weeks that followed, the dust began to settle. The store worked to implement their promised changes, including comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all employees, and the mayor's efforts to hold them accountable gained widespread respect. But the real impact of the incident wasn't just in the actions that followed. It was in the broader conversation that it sparked across the community. The mayor, ever calm and composed, addressed the city once again, this time in a public speech that resonated deeply with everyone who had been following the events. As she stood at the podium, the weight of her words felt significant, carrying the kind of gravitas that only comes from someone who truly understands the power of leading by example. We're living in a time where racial profiling is still far too common, she began, her voice strong but filled with compassion. Every day, countless people of color are made to feel like they don't belong in spaces where they should feel safe. It's not just an isolated issue. It's a systemic problem that affects people's lives, their dignity, and their sense of justice. She paused for a moment, her gaze steady, and continued, her words cutting through the tension that had hung over the city for days. But we must also remember that the fight for justice is not just about confronting injustice in anger, she said, her tone softening, yet still firm. It's about confronting it with dignity, with respect, and with an unwavering commitment to what is right. We must challenge injustice, but we must do so with dignity. Her voice rang out as she addressed the core of the issue, racial profiling, the unfair assumptions made based on the color of one's skin, and the need for both personal and systemic change. We must create a world where everyone, no matter their race, is treated with the respect and fairness they deserve. We cannot allow these assumptions to dictate how people are treated. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not judged by how they look or the stereotypes that others may have about them. The mayor's words lingered in the air, a quiet yet powerful call to action. The message was clear. Standing up for what is right, without giving in to anger, is not just possible, it's necessary. She had shown that through patience, composure, and leadership, it was possible to demand justice and hold people accountable without descending into chaos or bitterness. We cannot change what has already happened, she concluded, but we can change what happens next, and we do that by standing together, by supporting each other, and by refusing to let anyone be made to feel less than human based on who they are. The mayor's words left a lasting impact on the community. There were no grand gestures of celebration, no dramatic displays. Instead, the story ended on a note of quiet resolution, a message of unity, and a call for respect. The conversation around racial profiling continued, but now it was framed by the idea that confronting injustice doesn't have to mean losing one's dignity or resorting to anger. It can be about seeking understanding, holding people accountable, and creating a space where everyone is treated with fairness and respect. And so, the city moved forward, stronger and more aware than before, with a renewed commitment to respect and unity. The mayor had shown them that even in the face of injustice, it was possible to stand firm, demand accountability, and remain a beacon of dignity for all. We must challenge injustice, she had said, but we must do so with dignity. Everyone deserves respect, no matter their race. And in that quiet, powerful truth, the seeds for lasting change had been sown.